right. In the beginning, usernames and passwords were created. This meant that we could safely and securely access our accounts without fear of unwelcome visitors prying into our personal information or stealing them. And as the internet grew, so did the number of services online, which meant that we had to create separate usernames and passwords for every single one. And usually, what should have happened is we would create unique usernames and passwords for every single account. But what realistically happened is that we just reused them across different services. I am definitely someone who has done that. And that totally goes against the whole point of authentication, because now when someone has a credential, they can access multiple services. And so this made people very angry and has widely been regarded as a bad move. And so with that comes the Phyto Alliance, which is the Fast Identity Online Alliance. And they were created with the aim of unifying authentication online so that there was better strategies, better practices, and security was a first-class citizen online. And the issue is that authentication became really confusing. So people spoke in a completely different language, and lay developers couldn't quite understand what they meant by that. If you've ever tried to read a white paper by Phyto on WebAuthn or WebAuthO, Auth0, or anything like that, you would be like completely flabbergasted. I've tried, and it's horrible. And so this presentation is an aim at making that a little bit more understandable. It's called Authentication for the Rest of Us. My name is Divya Sasidharan. I am a developer advocate at Netlify. How many people use Netlify? Sweet. OK, not that many. That's fine. We build tools and workflows for helping you deploy your website. So if you have a static app or anything like that, we make it really easy for doing that. We also offer serverless workflows, similar to Azure, actually, but a little different. You can pick your battle or whatever. And so if you would like to learn more, come find me, and I have stickers, and hopefully that's like a nice bait for you to like use Netlify. And so with authentication comes a lot of panic, at least for me. I speak from my own experience. I am panicking. Why is it not working? OK. And so I just want you to know that we're going to be going everything in very, very thorough detail. So do not panic. Also, there'll be a lot of like very fun Hitchhikers references, super cheesy. And hopefully you enjoy them as much as I did creating this presentation. And so as we begin our authentication journey, it's important to figure out why authentication matters. I talked a little bit about this already, but I'm going to give you a concrete example so we can actually understand what we mean here. So say you're a Vogon, which is like an evil alien spaceship, or evil alien race, and you wanted to create plans to destroy the world. You don't want unauthorized users to have access to this because they might find it and then thwart your plans, and then the world is not destroyed, which will be terrible if you're a Vogon and you don't care. And so you might want to create like an authentication layer on top of it so that unauthorized users can't access it. So that's great. Only Vogons get to see the content that they should see about destroying the world. And so now that we have a sense of that, let's talk a little bit about the corollary to authentication, which is authorization. And I talked a little bit about this. Authorization is just permissions that a user has. So the electronic thumb is like pretty important in the Hitchhiker's Guide, which essentially, you don't have to know much about it. I'll explain everything. And so the electronic thumb is used by hitchhikers to hitchhike onto a passing spaceship, which is what Ford Prefect uses in the first part of the book. And so the electronic thumb can be seen as like an authentication device, loosely. And so with that, he can, or Ford Prefect can authenticate himself and notify passing ships that, hey, I'm a hitchhiker, and I'm looking for a ride. And that's really useful. And in terms of authorization, that's a totally different story, because even though the spaceship has been notified that there is a hitchhiker, Ford Prefect and Arthur Dent are not actually authorized to be on the ship or stay on the ship, and so they're booted off. And so there's this concept of like, yes, authentication notifies a service of who you are, and authorization gives you the ability or permissions as to whether or not you can access a service. So that's really handy. So now we have a sense of authentication, authorization, what that kind of means. And so let's dig into how it works. There's a lot of cool animations. And so most of us have come across authentication through a login page. It's the most simple, basic form of it, where there's a username and a password. I showed you this earlier. You sign in, you go through the auth workflow, where you see a loading page, maybe, and then eventually you get pushed to like a dashboard or an account page, a profile, and so on, with unique information as to your account. And under the hood, what's actually happening is, I'm going to talk about basic auth first. So basic is like the most base level authentication you could possibly have. And the idea is that, yes, you have your electronic thumb, cool, and you're sending a username and password up to the server. And the server responds in kind with like some text, some like bunch of numbers. And then you're like, cool. And so anytime you access a service that requires authentication, you're sending a authorization basic header, which allows you to then get resources that are protected. And then the server sends you like JSON or HTML or whatever else you need. Essentially, what that string of numbers and I think some characters, yes, that you see is, it is a username and a password separated with a colon and then base 64 encoded. So it's like not actually very secure. So I would really not recommend you doing that. And so the thing with basic auth also is that it's a one-to-one connection, because you're authorizing yourself with one single server. And most of our applications don't actually have that. You use multiples because microservices is handy, right? And so if you're authenticating with one single server and you were to move somewhere else, you're going to have to send all that information back and forth, because you have to like, OK, server 1, I authenticated myself. And then if you want to access server 2, you have to authenticate with that server, and then the next server, which is fine, like in theory. The issue with that is that it's really chatty, because you're constantly passing a username and password. Because I showed you earlier, the base 64 encoding has a username and password in it, which is really bad, because then, oh, why did my animation stop? Because passing Vogon ships can see you, and then they will attack you because they don't care about humans and hitchhikers, and this is very bad. And so the idea of this is that basic authorization, like authentication, is fine, but it's not the best way of authenticating your apps today. And so the alternative is you can use session-based auth, which is a different way of doing it. So again, we have like Ford Prefect and his towel, and he's passing a username and password up, and the server responds with like a session ID and a cookie. So this is like one way of doing session-based auth, which is generally how a lot of applications online handle authentication. So with the set cookie, now any client who wants to, or the client that wants to access the protected resource can send a like request, and in the request header, the cookie will always be there because the server set that cookie. So this is great. And then you can always get resources, which is also awesome. But again, we run into this issue, which is like you authenticate it with one server, and cookies are very much like domain specific. And so if any service is not within that domain, you cannot access it because cookies are domain specific. And so if you're like, hey, I need to access another Vogon ship or another Vogon ship for some reason, you cannot with this particular method, which is very sad. And so the thing that usually is very common in these days is like session-based auth is one thing, but token-based auth is like a better way of doing things. And so the difference is that token-based authentication is by default stateless. And so session-based means that the server always knows that you are logged on. And token-based means that the server has no idea and doesn't care, which is kind of nice because REST as a whole is generally stateless. And so you don't want to introduce state into your apps or into your server-side stuff. And so the idea is that you're sending, again, the same username and password. You're posting that to the server. And then the server gives you like a random string of text or characters, whatever, just like random things. And then you can now use that in a authorization header. I'm not using basic. I'm using authorization bearer, which is like just a general way of how you pass tokens. And then the server responds in kind with some extra like JSON and stuff, which is pretty cool. And so with token-based auth, I didn't really talk about this, but I will now, is JSON Web Tokens. This animation was very ambitious. And so the idea with JSON Web Token is that string of characters I showed you. It's kind of like garbledy-goop. But it's actually split into 3 parts. You have the header, which is the top part. You have the payload, which is the second piece of it. And then you have the signature. And I will go into this in very painful detail. And so the idea is that you have the first part, which is the header. And the header has an algorithm with HS-256. All you have to know is that there is 2 kinds, I believe. There's HS-256 and RS-256. RS-256 is asymmetrical. So if you've ever done like GitHub-based authentication, if you have private and public keys, that is RS-256. HS-256 is if a client and a server share a secret that they can encode and decode. That's essentially the difference between them. And you can choose whichever you like. I usually go with HS-256 because, I don't know, this is just arbitrary. And so then the second part is this type. And I'm just telling this specific thing that it's a JWT because it's a JWT. And then the second piece is the payload. So the payload has a couple of namespace options or keys. So name, sub, and exp being expiry. And these are just namespace things that you can pass into your payload. And then you obviously have the ability to add extra stuff. So there's add metadata, in which I can pass roles. And this like talks back to that previous point, which was about authorization. So JWTs are really nice because I can use it to set specific permissions for a user. So in this case, Ford Prefect is a journalist of some form. I think he is, I don't know. He writes for the guide, it's a very long story. And so the third part, which is like kind of the meat of the whole piece, is this point of signatures. And signatures is how a token is signed and what makes it authenticated, or encrypted actually is the proper word to use here. And so I'm using HMEC SHA-256, which is actually HS-256. HMEC SHA is just the longer way of saying it. And that essentially takes in a header and a payload, which is what we passed in earlier. And then it has like a secret as well, like a super secret, which you can pass, like you can create whatever secret you want, as long as you share that secret with your server so that your server can decode your JWT for permissions. If you'd like to learn more, there is a website by Auth0 called jwt.io. Super easy to remember. So easy, I didn't put it on the slide. And so if you're interested to learn more, it's really great because it shows you how to encode and decode tokens. So if you're interested in learning more, this is a great resource. And that's all. And so with JWT and token-based auth, we talked a lot about auth. It's very theoretical. Let's like get in the meats of implementation because like who cares about theory? We're developers. Well, yeah. I guess theory matters. And so I'm hoping this demo works. But I'm going to jump into a demo. Yes, it works. OK. And so I created a demo for creating JSON Web Tokens. It's a terrible idea. Do not do it ever because it's not secure. But this is created purely for demonstrative purposes. So all I'm doing is I have like, there's no password. It's just like a name. My name is Divya. My email is divya@netlify.com. Please don't send me spam. And I'm setting a specific role. So like in this case, it's admin. I can choose whatever I want. And then I can do generate token. And then it generates a token. And then it also pushes me on, because I did this like recently, it redirects me to a login page. So in this case, this is a super secret gated site that you cannot access without a token. So if I were to go back, there's a route called protected. If I access it, I have the proper like authorization to enter it. And this is of course like important because, for example, this demo was created. Actually, it doesn't actually matter what I write here. So it's a terrible, terrible thing. Do not write your own JWT stuff. And so now I cannot access my protected routes because I am of a visitor type. So you can kind of see that here on the top, which is like, yeah. You can see the breakdown, which is that I have random user metadata, and then my role is visitor. Because I am a visitor, I cannot access protected routes that I claim visitors cannot access, and so on. And so the idea is just to demonstrate that with JWTs, you can set user roles, you can add metadata, and then you can also use that to make sure that specific people cannot access routes. And so the general workflow of how that works is you have a login page, and then you have an authentication server. and which is what gives you that token to begin with. So I said server in general. I'm a front-end developer, so sometimes I'm like servers. And so I pass in like username and password, and then the server gives me like a JWT, which is what my app did. It's basically an authentication server. And then I can then access resource servers, which is like a separate site or a page with data, so on. And then that can give me, it's just, the essential point is that the resource server is sometimes protected, and an authentication server gives you a proper token, which you can then use to access a protected resource. And that's pretty much what that demo was. So there's like servers everywhere. Again, front-end developer, this is what I think about servers, just servers everywhere. And so, like Brian mentioned this a little bit, but I'm not gonna actually write server stuff. I'm gonna use functions as a service or serverless. The little people actually say there are servers in serverless. You can't really see it. It was meant as a joke. But the idea is that it's really nice because in general, authentication requires a server, but there are options for you to do authentication without having your own server or rolling your own authentication. So Okta, Auth0, like great options, all great options. I'm gonna use Netlify because I work there and I'm very familiar with their product. And so we're going to use like Netlify functions. You can use Azure too, actually. I think the code will translate quite well. And Netlify functions is not actually super unique, so it's run with Lambda. So if you're familiar with Lambda, it's pretty much the same thing, minus API gateway, which I think is wonderful, because I do not like API gateway. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a separate endpoint. So instead of like a server that has to run on like a proxy or whatever, I'm going to create a separate function endpoint in which I can get my JWT. So it's an authentication server, so to speak. And this is not real. Please do not enter this URL. It's not real. And so what I do for for the basic thing is I use a node module called JSON Web Token. Again, like this is purely for example. I feel like I have to say this constantly. Do not roll your own JWT ever. And then I'm using a UUID library to create a unique identifier for that user. And then this is where like very specific Netlify thing is, which is it uses exports.handler, which is just like a way of writing functions if you use Netlify. Again, very specific. You don't have to care about this if you choose not to. The meat of what happens in this whole thing that you should care about is that there is an EventUpBody, which is what I pass that username and email or whatever to. And then I'm parsing that, and I'm grabbing specific pieces of it. So there's claims, roles, and secret. Secret is like my super secret. I'm not going to tell you. It's a secret. And then roles is like whatever, if it's a visitor, an admin, editor, and so on. And then claims is just extra metadata associated. And then all I'm doing here is I'm getting an expiry date. I will show you the code in a second. And then I'm calling a GenerateGWT with all of these information. So get expiry date. Where is my code? It's gone. Never mind. It is all good. The idea of getExpiry is it just does like new date and then multiplies it and gets you the timestamp in Unix. So it's like 1 hour from now. That's about it. It's not very interesting. You can see it kind of up there in very gray. And so GenerateGWT is the main piece of what my function is doing to generate that JSON Web Token. It's grabbing an expiry, claims, role, and a secret, and then it's signing it. So this is, again, very specific to this library. It takes in an expiry, which is it has to be in Unix time. And then you can pass metadata to it. So I'm passing it in the roles. I'm passing in a user ID and various other things, which is claims. And then I'm passing in a secret, which is, again, like proprietary to whatever. And then I can call that with the specific thing. And then in my response, I can pass that token. So you can do it however you like. In this case, because it's a function endpoint, I'm just giving my whatever client the token that it so requests with the information. So it's in the body, super cool. And then now with this, I can basically use fetch. I think fetch was talked about earlier in the previous talk on I don't like JavaScript or something. And so you can fetch that endpoint. So you fetch it, and then it gives you that JSON Web Token in the body, which you can then use to access like super secret function endpoints. which is really cool. And you would post them as an authorization. Why did it stop? It's like magic move, horrible. Never mind. You basically pass it in as an authorization bearer, and that's like in the header, so that allows you to access a specific protected resource. And that is all for that piece of it. And so what I talked about was this idea of using authorization bearer as a header to like access a protected resource. The other way of doing it is you can use set cookie. So say you have a username and password, you can use a JWT in a cookie. You can do that if you'd like. So the server basically sets a cookie on the browser. And then now the browser, whenever it makes a request to a protected resource, it has the cookie in it. And then the resource server can then serve it data or whatever it needs to serve because it knows that the user has already been authenticated based on the cookie that has been served. So it's really nice and really handy. And so we'll come back to like the same piece of code that I showed you with like some modifications. So again, we're using JSON Web Token, but this time we're using a cookie library. And so I'm going to create a cookie. So I'm serializing a cookie. I'm going to name it like nf_JWT, which is like pretty arbitrary. But I think for Netlify, it's required for authentication. And then secure true is like very important because it allows like for cookies to be not like leaked out into things so people don't hear you. And then path is so that it's the same domain. So anything on that domain, that cookie can access or whatever. And then expiries is just like whatever the expiry date is, which I think I created. So expiry.toString, the new date is just getting the Unix time and then making it a date thing, which like I can't really explain why I had to do that. It was just annoying. And so now with what I did is that previously we passed in the authorization bearer header, but now what we're going to do is we're going to do a SetCookieHitter. And so with that, the client doesn't actually have to do a lot of work because the server or this like function as a service, serverless server code is setting the cookie on the client. And so every time the client now makes a request, it doesn't have to like explicitly pass the cookie, which is nice. And so that works in theory. This is going to take a while to load. So I will show you this one instead. No, this one, yes. Okay, so this is a separate piece, which is like, I just wanted to show you JSON Web Tokens and how those work. But now I'm going to show you actual authentication, like where you would probably use. And so this is an actual application called Chopsticks that helps you find food that you would pick up with chopsticks. And so the idea is it allows you to log in, and then you can see all these cool sites, and it has image optimization. I'm very proud of that. And then you can log out as well. So that's pretty cool, I think. And the main workflow of authentication, which is probably what you would do in your regular applications, is you would have like this is a general like sign up flow. So a user signs up, you get a confirmation email, and then they have to go through that. And then when they log in, which is like the bottom piece, they go through that confirmation process. So it's like, hey, is this user like a real user? And then it confirms them, and then they log in. Everything is great and fine and dandy. And so I know we talked about React. Someone talked about Angular. Ember was brought up. So I'm going to bring up Vue because I love Vue. And this is specifically Vuex. So Vuex is similar to Redux. I don't know Redux very well, so I can't make exact, but it's just the idea of state, global state management. And so for my specific authentication, I'm going to use a Vuex store. So I guess Redux Store is a thing. Yes. And so I'll create a new store called auth.js. And then within that store is where I will create my authentication piece. So there is like, next. I'm going to create like, I'm using GoTrue, which is like a open source authentication library. You can use Auth0, Okta, whatever you choose. And so this is like very specific to GoTrue. And then all I'm doing here is I'm creating an action. Why did my arrow not working? Yeah, so I'm creating an action called a Temp Login. So that's like called whenever a user clicks login. And a login flow has two pieces to it. There's like a new person logging in, and then there's a old person not an actual old person, but like someone who has a frequent user logging in and an infrequent user logging in. And so they're actually not too different in terms of flow. Like one has an extra step, which is the confirmation, and one doesn't. And so I'm going to combine them. So I'm going to do a temp confirmation, which just checks whether this user exists or not, or is a new user or not. And so if they are, and everything is successful, whatever. If they're not, whatever. And then it logs them in. So it does the confirmation step, and then it effectively logs them in. And then now the user exists. My arrows are just very slow today. And then all I'm doing is I'm setting it in a mutation, which then like saves that user, which I can use later on. This is very Vuex specific. So again, relatable to like React. You can just think about this and then translate it. This is my knowledge of React, clearly. And so with that, I'm just using like a form which submits a login, and then it has like some cool stuff. Map actions is like how I'm pulling from Vuex. And so the login essentially is like I'm grabbing that attempt login, and then I'm attempting the login with the credentials, and then I'm transferring it to dashboard, which is like pushing it to the router. So whenever a user logs in, then push them to a dashboard. That's pretty much it in terms of like the actual implementation of it. If you're really interested, there's a code base where it talks in heavy detail about how that works. But that is pretty much all there is to the authentication flow. And so one piece that I want to remind all of you is do not roll your own authentication. It's really generally a bad idea. There's lots of options available to you. As I said, Auth 0, why is my animations? It's fine. There's a lot of options available to you. I was very overzealous with my stuff. And so thank you so much for your time. I will be available later. I have stickers. Hopefully that is enough bait for you to come talk to me. And thank you so much for your time.